Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're doing something really cool. We're stepping right into the shoes of a student analyzing ancient biblical poetry. We're going to look closely at the text to figure out how a single word, a very specific, carefully chosen name, can completely shift the emotional weight and theological depth of a passage. So get ready to look at these ancient texts through a brand new lens. Okay, so let's dive into this by asking a crucial literary question that every student of ancient texts has to face. When ancient writers chose different names for God, were they just, mixing up their vocabulary so they wouldn't repeat themselves? Or were they trying to tell us something much deeper? Well, in biblical poetry, every single word carries weight, and the names used for the divine are absolutely no exception. They act as keys to unlocking the underlying message. Before we open up our texts, let's take a quick look at today's study guide. We'll start with reading ancient Hebrew poetry, then look at Eloah in the book of Job. From there, we'll explore the theme of human dependence, majesty amidst human suffering, and finally, unlocking the poetic message. Part 1. Reading ancient Hebrew poetry, examining the words of the text. As students of literature, our absolute first step is to unpack the original language. We need to understand the tone the authors were trying to set. And looking at these terms brilliantly illustrates the contrast we need to grasp. First, we have El. This is the foundational root word emphasizing raw, unadulterated strength and might. Then you have Elohim, which is the most common term for God, used to express absolute supremacy. But then we have Eloah. This is a singular, deeply poetic variation. While Elohim is your standard term used in historical narratives and laws, Eloah is chosen for very specific, reflective, and highly emotional contexts. Trust me, the ancient poets did not use this word by accident. When a biblical poet drops the name Eloah, they are deliberately grabbing us by the collar and calling our attention to God's ultimate greatness, His majesty, His authority, especially when you compare it to our own glaring limitations. But here's the thing, it's not just about distant power. It's actually an incredibly personal term. It pulls the reader into an intimate, often painful, but always profound relationship with the divine. Moving right along to part 2. Eloah in the book of Job, wrestling with suffering and sovereignty. In Job chapter 3, we encounter a man who is just completely broken. He's literally just lost his children, his vast wealth, his physical health, and all his security. It's devastating. And in response, Job utters this agonizing lament, basically cursing the day of his birth. Now, the Hebrew word translated as God right here in this verse, it's Eloah. What's profoundly interesting here is the theological statement embedded deep in the poetry. Even in the midst of total confusion and unimaginable suffering, Job uses this deeply personal, majestic name. By crying out to Eloah, Job is acknowledging that despite his absolute agony, God's ultimate authority and existence remain firmly intact. He's speaking directly to the sovereign creator, not just some generic deity. As we read later into the text, we actually see the poetry shifting. It moves from this raw grief to inspiring awe and reverence. The text paints Eloah as the sovereign, mysterious ruler over all of creation. He's the controller of nature, who is simply, beyond our full human understanding. The poetry uses this name to remind us that God's ways are higher, and His power is absolute. Which brings us to part 3, the theme of human dependence, fragility versus eternity. Across these ancient texts, humanity is consistently painted as fragile and temporary. Our understanding is severely limited. The poetry frequently uses metaphors, like in Psalm 103, comparing human life to grass that just sprouts up and then quickly fades away. The poetic use of Eloahs constantly reminds the reader that humans are entirely dependent beings. We literally rely on an outside source for every single breath and every ounce of our strength. In stark contrast to that human fragility, we have the nature of Eloah. Eloah alone possesses eternal power. Eloah is self-existent, meaning he doesn't need anyone or anything to survive. He knows all things completely and continually sustains the universe. The poetry sets our fading, temporary nature directly against this unchanging, eternal reality. So the crucial point is captured just beautifully in this quote from Job 33. Eloah is not some distant clockmaker deity who just wound up the universe and walked away. No, rather, Eloah is the active, intimate source of life itself. He actively sustains creation right now. This poetic realization demands humility from the reader. It forces us to recognize our total, complete reliance upon Him, rather than our own fading strength. Let's look at part 4. majesty amidst human suffering, trusting infinite wisdom. The biblical wisdom literature does not shy away from the hard stuff. It asks those agonizing questions. Why is there suffering? How does divine justice actually operate when innocent people hurt? As Job 11 asks, can we really find out the deep things of God? What's brilliant here is that the text doesn't offer simplistic, neat little answers tied with a bow. Instead, it emphasizes that the purposes of Eloah often completely surpass our limited human comprehension. But despite the mystery of suffering, the text firmly establishes its stance on God's character. As seen in Deuteronomy, the ancient writers held that Eloah is never corrupt and never unjust. His judgments are considered perfect. The poetry acts as a powerful call to believers. It asks them to trust in the infinite wisdom of Eloah, especially during those seasons of profound uncertainty and pain when literally nothing makes sense. And this perfectly illustrates another key literary contrast. The biblical writers frequently use the name Eloah to sharply contrast the one true God against the surrounding ancient cultures. While those other cultures worshipped idols, lifeless objects associated with nature, crafted by human hands, Eloah is presented as the living, eternal, all-powerful creator. It's a bold, undeniable assertion of monotheism, a statement that no earthly power or invented idol can even begin to compare. Now, for the biblical student, this story definitely doesn't end in the ancient wisdom literature. From a New Testament perspective, those deep, agonizing questions of suffering and justice raised by the use of Eloah in the Old Testament find their ultimate resolution. As Colossians states, the whole fullness of deity dwells in Jesus Christ. Christ actually demonstrates the very attributes of Eloah, power over nature, sickness, and death, showing that the majestic, mysterious God of Job has stepped directly into the human experience of suffering. Finally, Part 5, Unlocking the Poetic Message, the Call to Humility and Awe. The text maps out a very clear spiritual journey for the reader. When you truly encounter Eloah in the poetry, the response is basically a four-step progression. First, you recognize his infinite greatness. Second, that realization completely humbles human pride, even when we're suffering. Third, we are called to trust his divine wisdom over our own limited logic. And finally, this entire journey moves the reader from a place of confusion and grief into a posture of true, awe-inspired worship and obedience. This single line from the very end of the book of Job, it perfectly captures that massive shift in tone. After chapters and chapters of wrestling, complaining, and demanding answers, Job finally witnesses the majesty of Eloah. And suddenly, his intense intellectual questioning just melts away into a deeply personal, relational encounter. My eyes see you. The head gives way to the heart. So what you should take away from this explainer is that biblical faith isn't just some intellectual exercise in reading ancient languages. The poetic choice of Eloah teaches us that God is supreme in wisdom, that we depend on him for every single breath we take, and that he remains completely sovereign and just, even when life is incredibly dark. It reminds us that God is both majestically above us and yet intimately near to those who seek him. As we close our ancient texts today, I want to leave you with this thought to reflect upon in your own study. The writers of these poems faced the exact same pain and confusion we do today. The question they challenge us with is this: when the mysteries of life completely overwhelm you, will you lean on your own temporary, fading understanding? Or will you let the poetry guide you to surrender to the awe and wisdom of Eloah? Thanks for learning with me today. Keep asking great questions and keep exploring the text.